537 million people worldwide suffer from diabetes, and another 541 million suffer from prediabetes. That means that of every 10 adults worldwide, more than 2 have either diabetes or prediabetes. There is a lot of poor or misleading information out there on the internet on blood sugar regulation, insulin resistance, and diabetes. So my goal with this video is to make sure you fully understand exactly how our bodies regulate our blood sugar levels, what goes wrong with this process when we develop diabetes, and how diabetes is diagnosed. We're starting with the very basics, carbohydrates. I don't want to bore you with the chemical structures or formulas, so let's just say that the basic building blocks of carbohydrates are simple sugars, sometimes also called monosaccharides. The term saccharide simply means sugar, and mono means one. So the word monosaccharide describes carbs with one sugar molecule. The most important monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose and fructose can be found in our food in fruit, honey, or high fructose corn syrup, and we tend to like them because they taste sweet to us. When we eat food with simple sugars, our body can absorb it into our bloodstream without any need for digestion. Simple sugars can also combine to form more complex carbohydrates. For example, one glucose molecule and one fructose molecule bound together forms sucrose, commonly called table sugar. Because this now has 2 of these simple sugars bound to each other, we call this a disaccharide. Di stands for 2, so a disaccharide is a carbohydrate made from 2 simple sugar molecules. Another example of a disaccharide is lactose, milk sugar, which consists of 1 molecule of glucose and 1 molecule of galactose. When we eat a disaccharide, our body needs to digest it before the simple sugars can be absorbed into the body. Digestion here means that enzymes are secreted into the small intestinal tract, and these enzymes then cut these connections so that now we have simple sugar molecules that can be absorbed. And then we have the larger, more complex carbohydrates that contain many molecules of simple sugars. These are called polysaccharides. Poly means many. So polysaccharides are therefore large molecules consisting of many molecules of simple sugars. Starch is one example. It's a chain of many glucose molecules. These can be simply connected in a straight chain like that, or in a branched chain. Starch is a very common one in our diet because we find it in potatoes, starchy vegetables, and all types of grains, such as wheat, rice, or corn. In starch, the glucose molecules are connected in such a way that human digestive enzymes can cut the ties, meaning that if we eat wheat or rice or potatoes, the starch gets broken down into single glucose molecules in our GI tract, and then we can absorb these into the bloodstream. Another important polysaccharide is glycogen. Glycogen is similar to some starches in that it is a highly branched chain of glucose molecules, but it is found in human or animal cells and used to store glucose. We'll get back to this one later. Another common polysaccharide is cellulose. It's similar to starch in that it consists of chains of glucose molecules, but the one important difference here is that humans cannot break these chains apart, and therefore we cannot digest cellulose. For us, cellulose is therefore considered a fiber. The last group of carbohydrates I'd like to touch on are oligosaccharides. Oligo stands for few, and this category describes carbohydrates with 3 to 10 simple sugar molecules. Examples of oligosaccharides include oligofructose and inulin, which you'll find in foods such as onions, leeks, and wheat. In general, humans lack the enzymes to digest oligosaccharides, and these are therefore also considered fiber for us. So those carbs that we can digest get absorbed into the bloodstream in the form of their single sugar molecule components, the main ones being glucose, fructose, and galactose. Interestingly, almost all fructose and galactose are immediately removed from the bloodstream by the liver, and concentrations of fructose and galactose in our blood circulation are very, very low. We'll talk about what happens to fructose and galactose and other sugars another time. For now, what I'd like you to remember is that when we talk about blood sugar, what we really mean is blood glucose, because glucose always accounts for 90+% of all the sugar in our blood, even after a meal rich in fructose or galactose. The second thing I'd like you to know is that if we're healthy, our blood sugar levels are very tightly regulated by our body. Usually in the fasting state, a normal blood glucose concentration is somewhere in the range of 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. Let's just say 90 milligrams per deciliter. Now, even if we don't eat anything, our blood sugar levels would stay roughly in this range for quite a long time. And that is even though our tissues, particularly our brain, are constantly taking a little bit of glucose from the blood and burning it as fuel. Our blood sugar levels are kept steady while we're fasting by a hormone called glucagon that is produced by the pancreas that stimulates the liver to release a constant trickle of glucose into the blood. That glucose comes from glycogen stored in the liver. Remember, glycogen being similar to starch, and there's just a chain of glucose molecules. So while we are fasting, glucagon stimulates the liver to break down stored glycogen and release glucose to keep blood glucose levels stable. If we fast for a very long time, the liver can also make new glucose, mostly from amino acids, the building blocks of protein. Now let's assume we break our fast with some bread or cornflakes or oatmeal. All of these consist mostly of starch, maybe with some added sugar. So after digestion, mostly glucose molecules enter our bloodstream from the GI tract, and our blood glucose levels start to rise. In healthy people, depending on how many and what types of carbs the meal contained, blood glucose levels typically reach somewhere around 140 milligrams per deciliter at the peak. Depending on the carbohydrate content of the meal, this could be a very small increase, like so here, or it could be a pretty substantial increase, maybe up to 180 milligrams per deciliter or so. Before this peak is even reached, though, the incoming glucose is sensed, and the pancreas stops the production of glucagon and instead now releases another hormone into the bloodstream, insulin. So if you plotted insulin levels on this graph here, let's say in green, this is what this may look like in a healthy person. Insulin tells the liver to stop releasing glucose into the blood. That makes sense, right? Because we now have large amounts of glucose coming into the blood from the GI tract. In liver, muscle, and fat tissue, insulin binds to the insulin receptor on the surface of cells, and that causes a specific glucose transporting molecule called GLUT4 to be transported to the cell membrane. Glucose can then enter these cells from the blood through this GLUT4 transporter. As a result of all of these actions of insulin, blood glucose levels start to fall and eventually reach their steady state level of around 90 milligrams per deciliter again. And at that point, insulin is no longer needed, and insulin levels also drop down to baseline. Depending on the size of our meal, this typically takes 1 to 3 hours, and only if you are metabolically healthy. If you have prediabetes or diabetes, this curve looks potentially quite different, as we'll see next. So what does the term glucose tolerance mean? And what is normal glucose tolerance compared to prediabetes and diabetes? If we are glucose tolerant, it means that our bodies can keep our blood glucose level within the normal range, no matter how many carbohydrates we eat in a meal. So when I say normal range, what do I mean with normal? Let's see how normal glucose tolerance, prediabetes, and diabetes are defined clinically. One way to test someone's glucose tolerance is to conduct an all-glucose tolerance test, or OGTT. The OGTT is a clinical procedure in which a person is fasting and then drinks a beverage containing 75 grams of pure glucose. That's 15 teaspoons of sugar. The doctor draws blood before the glucose beverage is consumed, and then again exactly 2 hours after the person started drinking the glucose beverage. We would have normal glucose tolerance if our blood glucose level was lower than 100 milligrams per deciliter in the fasting state and lower than 140 milligrams per deciliter at the 2-hour time point of the OGTT. So this here is how the blood glucose levels may change in a healthy person with normal glucose tolerance in response to a 75-gram glucose OGTT beverage. Fasting glucose would be lower than 100 milligrams per deciliter. The glucose level would then rise and fall back to under 140 milligrams per deciliter at the 2-hour mark. Prediabetes is defined as fasting blood glucose between 100 milligrams per deciliter and less than 126 milligrams per deciliter, and between 140 and less than 200 milligrams per deciliter at the 2-hour time point in the standardized OGTT. So if we continuously measured the blood glucose level during the OGTT in someone with prediabetes, we would get a glucose curve that may look like this here. Diabetes is diagnosed when fasting blood glucose is 126 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and or if the glucose level is 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher 2 hours after the OGTT. So in someone with uncontrolled diabetes, the glucose levels during the OGTT may look like this here, potentially quite high at around 150 milligrams per deciliter in the fasting state, and then rising to over 300 milligrams per deciliter and staying quite elevated at the 2-hour time point. There is another test that is often used to diagnose diabetes or to determine how well someone's diabetes is controlled by diet or medication, and that is the HbA1c or A1c test. This test is based on the fact that glucose tends to get attached to proteins in our blood, and the higher our average blood glucose levels are, the more glucose attaches to our blood proteins. A very abundant protein in our blood is hemoglobin, the protein that transports oxygen around the body. So what we measure with the HbA1c or A1c test, officially also called glycated hemoglobin test, is the degree to which glucose has attached itself to hemoglobin molecules in the blood. This is expressed in percent, and less than 5.7% means normal glucose tolerance. Between 5.7% and 6.4% is indicative of prediabetes, and 6.5% or higher is indicative of diabetes. The HbA1c value gives us an idea of the average glucose concentration over the last 3 months or so. As you can imagine, over 3 months there is a lot of up and down in our blood glucose levels, and so the average of that determines the HbA1c. A HbA1c of 5.6%, for example, means that the average glucose concentration in blood over the past 3 months was about 117 milligrams per deciliter. 6.5% indicates an average of 140 milligrams per deciliter. So what a good clinician will do if they suspect someone may have diabetes is look at the HbA1c and also do an oral glucose tolerance test. If the test results come back totally in the diabetic range, let's say HbA1c of 8.5, fasting glucose of 165 milligrams per deciliter, and 2-hour glucose in the OGTT of 320 milligrams per deciliter, they would diagnose this as diabetes and start treatment right away. Similarly, if all of the values are clearly in the normal, healthy range, then we can be certain that the patient does not have diabetes or prediabetes. A lot of times, though, these tests are not so conclusive, partly because they tend to vary a little bit from one measurement to the next. It could be, for example, that someone's HbA1c suggests diabetes, but the fasting and 2-hour OGTT data are borderline. In those cases, the doctor would probably run these tests again a little while later. Now, what is really amazing about blood sugar is how well this is actually regulated. Think about it this way. An adult man has about 6 liters of blood. That's about 1.5 gallons. That's a little bucket full. At a fasting glucose concentration of 90 milligrams per deciliter, a deciliter being 100 milliliters, that makes for a total of 5.4 grams of sugar in all of the fasting blood. That's about a teaspoon of sugar in a little bucket. Now, let's say you do an OGTT and drink a beverage containing 15 teaspoons of glucose. How much does the blood sugar level go up? In healthy people, maybe to 160 milligrams per deciliter. That corresponds to 9.6 grams of sugar in all of your blood. That's 2 teaspoons of sugar. So all of your blood in the fasting state only has about 1 teaspoon of sugar in it. And even if you gulp something down that has 15 teaspoons of glucose, the amount of glucose in all of your blood never exceeds about 2 teaspoons at a time. That is because the body senses glucose coming in very quickly, already when it's in your mouth actually, and makes sure that it's ready to take up glucose from the blood as all of the dietary glucose is being absorbed. And so it's really a pretty great example of how miraculous a healthy body is and how well this really works. And I would add, it actually still works fairly well even in people with diabetes, just not as well as in a healthy person. So why is it that some people are super glucose tolerant and others have diabetes and their blood sugar level goes up, quite a lot when they just have a little snack? It's the result of a few things going wrong in the body. Let's start by talking about insulin resistance. Let's take a look at 2 guys, Jack and Ben. They both complete an oral glucose tolerance test, and lo and behold, they end up having exactly the same glucose levels during the test. As we can see, in both men, fasting glucose is lower than 100 milligrams per deciliter, and 2-hour glucose is lower than 140 milligrams per deciliter. So they both have perfectly normal glucose tolerance. However, if we took a look at their insulin levels during this oral glucose tolerance test, we would see some striking differences. Jack's insulin levels start very low, rise modestly throughout the test, and then go back to baseline. This is very different from Ben's insulin levels. These already are modestly higher at baseline, but then they really take off like a rocket. These are extremes, but taken from actual people, obviously not called Jack or Ben, who participated in a clinical trial my group ran a few years ago. What is going on here? Well, they consumed the exact same amount of glucose, and they were similarly able to keep blood glucose levels regulated within the normal range. But Ben's body needed a lot more insulin to keep blood glucose levels in that normal range. This means that Ben is more insulin resistant than Jack. Or if we express it the other way around, Jack is more insulin sensitive than Ben. A little bit of insulin is all it takes for Jack to regulate blood sugar levels perfectly. Ben's tissues, you could say, have gotten numb to insulin to some degree, and they need a lot more insulin to clear glucose from the blood the same way as Jack does. It is similar to say if your taste of salt was diminished due to some disease and everything started to taste a little bland, then you would just need to add more salt to make up for that, and you would basically perceive the same level of saltiness in the food. Insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance are relative terms though, and there are no clearly established clinical thresholds to diagnose insulin resistance like we have for blood glucose. So there are two things going on here with Ben. One of these is clearly not a good thing because his high insulin levels show that he is very insulin resistant. The other is positive though, and that is that his body is able to make this much insulin. Insulin is produced by cells called beta cells in the pancreas, and what we would say is that the beta cells in his pancreas are very healthy. He has good beta cell function because his beta cells are able to make more insulin if necessary. That is not the case for everyone. If we were to plot insulin sensitivity here on the x-axis against insulin production by the pancreatic beta cell on the y-axis, people like Jack in our example, who are very insulin sensitive, would be here. Insulin sensitivity is high, and the amount of insulin produced by his beta cells is low. That is not to say that his beta cells could not produce more insulin, they just don't have to. Ben, by comparison, would be somewhere here. His insulin sensitivity is a lot lower, and as a result, his beta cells have to make a lot more insulin. In fact, if we measured insulin sensitivity and pancreas insulin production in a large group of healthy people with normal glucose tolerance, we would get a cloud like this here. Note how they cover the entire range of insulin sensitivity measures, from very insulin sensitive to very insulin resistant. What they all have in common is that their beta cells in the pancreas can produce enough insulin to keep blood sugar levels in a normal range. How much insulin needs to be produced depends on how insulin sensitive their bodies are. These folks here are very insulin sensitive, so their beta cells need to make fairly little insulin. These people up here are not very insulin sensitive, so their beta cells need to make a lot of insulin. In all of these people, blood sugar levels are in the normal range, and if you only measured their blood sugar level, you wouldn't know that they actually differ quite a bit in how they achieve their normal blood sugar levels. Let's just make this area green, showing that as long as someone's insulin sensitivity and beta cell insulin production fall into this area, they have normal blood sugar regulation. As a side note, for those of you who are interested in the technicalities, the product of insulin sensitivity on the x-axis and the acute insulin response to glucose, which is a measure of beta cell insulin production and shown here on the y-axis, is commonly called the disposition index. So Ben and Jack here, even though they differ a lot in their insulin sensitivity, may have a similar disposition index and as a result, similar glucose tolerance. So what if you become insulin resistant and your pancreas cannot make any more insulin? Let's take a look at this gentleman here, Fred. This dot here is Fred at age 25. He's lean and plays a lot of sports. His insulin sensitivity is very high, and as a result, his beta cells don't need to produce a lot of insulin. He's totally glucose tolerant, meaning no matter how many carbs he eats, his blood sugar levels are always within a normal range. 10 years later, Fred has gained 20 pounds. As we'll discuss in a separate video, an increase in body weight and particularly fat mass is one of the factors that reduces insulin sensitivity. So now, with the higher body fat mass, he is right here. He is less insulin sensitive, but his beta cells were able to keep up with the higher demand. He is still fully glucose tolerant, and his glucose levels are about the same as they were when he was 25. So there has clearly been a change in how his body handles glucose, but clinically it isn't apparent yet. Another 10 years later, and Fred is now 45 years old, and he has gained another 20 pounds. Now, to be clear, this could continue on this imaginary line where every time Fred gets more insulin resistant, his beta cells are able to produce more insulin. He wouldn't even know this is happening. Fred is not so lucky though. He is now here. He is again more insulin resistant than at age 35, and now his beta cells were not able to keep up with demand, at least not fully. We could also say that his beta cells are no longer able to compensate for his insulin resistance. So what we have here now is a state where his circulating insulin levels are quite high and potentially higher than when Fred was 25 or 35, but not high enough for his level of insulin resistance. His body is now no longer able to keep his blood sugar levels within a normal range, and as a result, he now has prediabetes. Note that his fasting blood sugar levels may still be normal, but if his doctor conducted an OGTT or measured an HbA1c, these would likely be slightly elevated. Another 10 years later, and Fred has again gained 20 pounds. Now he has gotten even more insulin resistant. Now, not only are his pancreatic beta cells unable to keep up with demand, they actually make less insulin than before. And now he is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Now the big question, why is the pancreas able to produce so much more insulin in Ben here, our example from earlier in the video, but not in Fred? This topic is deserving of a separate video, but for now, let's just say that whether or not your pancreatic beta cells can increase their insulin output if they have to, is to a fairly large degree related to genetic factors. That said, it is also clear that other factors that we can potentially influence also play a role here. Let's take a couple other examples of diabetes. Let's say this here is Lisa. She is 10 years old, healthy and physically active. She develops type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease in which the body's immune system destroys the beta cells in the pancreas. At least acutely, this doesn't affect her level of insulin sensitivity, but what would be expected over, say, a few years when she loses much of her healthy beta cells is that her level of insulin production drops, like this here. And as a result, she also first develops prediabetes and then type 1 diabetes. Or Monica. She's an overweight 30-year-old woman. She is a little bit insulin resistant, but her beta cells produce a little bit more insulin and she remains totally glucose tolerant and healthy. But now she is pregnant. Pregnancy, just like puberty, is a phase in which it is natural to become insulin resistant. For Monica, she moves here, a lot lower insulin sensitivity, and her beta cells are unable to keep up with the higher demand. She now has gestational diabetes. Once she gives birth, her insulin sensitivity would be expected to recover mostly, and the gestational diabetes may go away again. What this shows, though, for Monica is that her personal maximum beta cell output is somewhere around here, and if she becomes insulin resistant for another reason, such as weight gain, later in her life, she will likely develop type 2 diabetes. So how are insulin sensitivity and pancreatic beta cell function affected by common diabetes treatments? In general, any intervention that improves either insulin sensitivity or the amount of circulating insulin would be expected to move someone towards that normal glucose tolerance range, marked in this graph in green. For example, Fred's doctor may suggest he lose some weight. That would improve his insulin sensitivity, and depending on how much fat mass he loses and how fast, it may also modestly improve his beta cell ability to produce insulin. He may improve like this, and his blood sugar levels would now be better controlled. if he had bariatric surgery and lost, say, 50 pounds or more, he would likely be able to become a lot more insulin sensitive and potentially reverse his diabetes. Fred could also be given a drug such as metformin that improves insulin sensitivity. Or he could be given a drug such as sulfonylureas that improve insulin production. Or he could be given insulin directly by injection, which would also be the treatment for Lisa here to replace the insulin she can no longer produce herself. Again, all of these interventions that improve either insulin sensitivity or circulating insulin levels would be expected to improve the body's ability to regulate blood sugar levels. This will not in all cases lead to normal blood sugar levels though. Obviously, we can affect our blood sugar regulation also by what we eat, but there is so much to say about this that I will make several separate videos about this. So far, we have discussed how blood sugar levels are regulated after a meal by the hormone insulin. We have seen that insulin acts directly on the liver to stop it from releasing glucose, and it also directly acts on muscle and fat cells, which causes these cells to take up glucose from the blood. Through these actions, insulin gets blood sugar levels reduced and normalized after a meal in healthy people. We also discussed that the sensitivity of cells to insulin varies a lot from person to person, and that it is critical that the pancreatic beta cells are healthy and able to produce more insulin if someone is insulin resistant. But insulin acting on cells directly is actually not the major mechanism by which glucose is cleared from the blood after a meal. Let me say this again because this may be a bit of a surprise to many of you. Insulin acting on cells directly is not the major mechanism by which glucose is cleared from the blood after a meal, at least not in healthy people. So let's close with a discussion of the other part of the equation, insulin-independent blood sugar regulation. This is something that's very rarely discussed, but it has been known for a long time that cells can take up glucose from the blood also through a mechanism that does not involve insulin. A prominent example for this is glucose uptake into a muscle that is being exercised. But that is not the only example. Now also clear that whenever our blood sugar levels rise after a meal, the elevated glucose itself contributes to greater clearance from the blood in a way that does not involve a direct effect of insulin on these cells. We know about this phenomenon mostly from modeling the changes in blood glucose and insulin levels after a meal or during an OGTT. These models show that the clearance of glucose from blood can only partly be explained by the actions of insulin. And actually, using these models, it has been estimated that in healthy people, only 30 to 50% of glucose disposal after a meal can be attributed to the direct actions of insulin on peripheral cells. The ability of glucose to stimulate its own disposal is called glucose effectiveness. It basically relates to the effectiveness of glucose itself to regulate blood sugar levels. The reality is that we don't yet know a lot about this process. We have a lot of gaps in this area because much of the research on glucose effectiveness has been done in rodent models, and the relative importance and mechanisms of glucose effectiveness may differ in rodents versus humans. To study glucose effectiveness in humans, we need fairly complicated clinical tests that are never done in clinical settings and rarely even in clinical studies. We also need to conduct sophisticated mathematical modeling to separate the role of insulin-mediated versus insulin-independent regulation of blood sugar levels. So how does glucose effectiveness work? Well, as I said, we have many gaps in our understanding here, but it's clear that elevated blood glucose levels play a role, and likely a number of hormones. Now, I'm calling this insulin-independent, but the truth is that insulin may actually play some role in this glucose effectiveness, just not by acting directly on liver, muscle, or fat cells, but by acting on the brain. Same for glucose, elevated levels of which are likely sensed by the brain. Other hormones that may also directly signal to the brain may include FGF19 and the incretin hormones GIP and GLP-1. So the scenario most consistent with the available data is that the brain senses elevated blood sugar levels and also receives signals from all of these hormones as well, and then the brain in turn regulates the ability of the body cells to take up glucose from the blood. Which cells are specifically involved here is also not clear. It's likely that insulin-independent tissues, such as the brain itself, take up more glucose if needed, but it almost certainly also affects other cells. Now, these hormones that I mentioned, FGF19, GIP, and GLP-1, they're not familiar to you. Just know these are all hormones that are regulated in some capacity in relation to food intake. So they're just basically other signals that the brain can integrate to fine-tune the blood sugar levels. So overall, what you can probably appreciate is that this is quite different from what we discussed earlier in the video. In classical insulin-dependent glucose uptake, insulin binds to the insulin receptor on a specific cell, and then that cell takes up glucose. Glucose effectiveness seems to be a process that is at least partly centrally mediated by the brain. Now, glucose effectiveness is very interesting because we know that it is actually substantially reduced in people with obesity, and we also know that the reduction in glucose effectiveness is almost certainly a major contributor to type 2 diabetes. Now, why did evolution equip us with two complementary systems to regulate blood sugar levels? One benefit of regulating something through the brain is that the brain can take in many different inputs, for example, from blood glucose levels themselves, as well as the concentrations of different hormones. One hypothesis is that having the brain involved in blood sugar regulation is that it can be better able to fine-tune the response and minimize the risk of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia means blood sugar levels that are too low, which could be a life-threatening condition. I absolutely appreciate that this discussion was maybe a bit more complicated than you asked for, but I'm hoping you were able to follow along. If you're still unclear about what I have been talking about here in the section on glucose effectiveness, let me give you the take-home points. First, blood sugar is partly taken up by cells through a mechanism that does not involve a direct effect of insulin on these cells. Second, this effect is partly regulated by blood sugar levels themselves, but likely also a number of hormones. Third, glucose effectiveness may partly be regulated by the brain. And fourth, glucose effectiveness is also disturbed in type 2 diabetes and is likely as much a cause of type 2 diabetes as insulin resistance and pancreatic beta cell dysfunction. To summarize, our body goes to great lengths to make sure that our blood sugar levels always stay within a certain, fairly narrow range. When we eat glucose-containing carbohydrates, such as sugar or starch, several mechanisms play together to clear the glucose from the blood and prevent the blood sugar from rising too much. These include insulin-dependent and insulin-independent clearance of sugar from the blood. How well insulin-dependent clearance works is dependent on how sensitive tissues are to insulin and how much insulin the pancreatic beta cells can produce. There are numerous factors that affect insulin sensitivity as well as the ability of the pancreas to produce as much insulin as is needed. I'll cover these in follow-up videos, and these should be pretty interesting because many of these factors are modifiable by our diet and lifestyle. How well the body is able to clear glucose from the blood in a manner that is independent of insulin is also highly variable. We do know that this process called glucose effectiveness is reduced in overweight and obesity, but beyond that, we have a lot of gaps and not much known as yet about the factors that determine glucose effectiveness. So what is really going on in type 2 diabetes is that glucose effectiveness is reduced, insulin sensitivity is reduced, and the pancreatic beta cell is unable to produce enough insulin to keep up with the increased insulin demand. Only then do we clinically develop type 2 diabetes. Any intervention that can improve either of these components, glucose effectiveness, insulin sensitivity, or beta cell function, would be expected to improve glucose tolerance. So in this video, we covered the basics of blood sugar regulation. I have plans for many more videos on how blood sugar regulation is affected by our body weight and fat mass, diet, sleep, stress, exercise, medication, and bariatric surgery. Diet will obviously be a big focus, and I have plans to talk about the acute effects of different foods or dietary factors on blood sugar levels, but also the long-term effects of diet on insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance. We will cover mechanistic links between all of these things here on the left and blood sugar regulation to see what actually happens inside of our body that causes defects in blood sugar regulation. I also have plans for videos about the long-term health consequences of diabetes and what is known about how we can prevent and even reverse diabetes. If you're interested in any of this, I suggest you subscribe to the channel. And please leave a comment or go to my website at www.nourishedbyscience.com and use the contact form to let me know if there is anything in particular that you would like to see discussed. Same if anything was unclear in this video. Alrighty, that's it for today. If you thought this was helpful, I would appreciate it if you lightly tap that thumbs up button down there somewhere. Alright, thank you. Take care.